The following is a presentation of the Matt Talk Podcast Network.
It's a Short-Time Wrestling Podcast, news, reviews, previews, and interviews from in and around the sport of wrestling. I'm your host, Jason Bryant, with you as always. Today, we center around Division II wrestling and Truman State, as on May the 2nd, the school announced that it was axing its wrestling and men's tennis program. Today, joining us on the program is the athletic director of Truman State University, Mr. Jerry Wollmering. And first of all, Jerry, thanks for taking the time out. We realize this is kind of a tough spot for any school to be in.
All right. Sure. No problem, Jason.
All right, just let's get the timeline. So May the 2nd, this comes out, and according to the press release, there's been kind of a suggested budget shortfall, or the terminology is just the school's not getting as much money as it was in the past. And just from an administrative standpoint, kind of take us through the release on why wrestling and men's tennis were targeted for these cuts and how that played into the bigger picture of what the budget really is.
Sure. Well, here at Truman State University, basically we have two main sources of revenue for our operation, and that's obviously being a public institution, our state appropriations, and which last year, after getting cut over $3.5 million from withholding from the state, basically the funding we're getting from the state is about the same as it was in 1999, and So that, and basically our net tuition revenue. So those obviously our students are a big source of revenue as well. And when I say net, obviously because a lot of our students, Truman's is a highly selective public liberal arts institution. A lot of our students come here with high academic achievements and earn academic scholarships through the university as well. So. Basically facing, and then the governor for next year came out and recommended a 7.73% additional cut for higher education, and for Truman that was going to mean another $3.5 million, and so really every area on campus was given a charge to that we had to reduce our spending, reduce budgets. So athletics was no different than, the academic affairs department, the advancement department, IT, whatever department it may be. So, so we go through the same budget process that every other area on campus. We don't generate, again, a lot of our own money, not like some of the, Division I schools. We don't get revenue from the NCAA based on sports, things like that. So, when we went through the budget process, and obviously our number was well into the six-figure range of needing to cut, and really felt after so many years of across-the-board cuts, since I've been here, this is my 19th year at Truman. Our operating budget is pretty much the same as it was, 19 years ago in terms of spending power as costs have gone up over time. So, unfortunately, we looked at everything that we could and ultimately came to the decision that we did.
What's the overall projected savings according to your numbers on the elimination of these two sports in terms of the athletic budget to take into that estimated reduction in the millions of dollars? Sure.
For wrestling and tennis combined, right around $100,000, a little over $100,000. For wrestling, we were spending over $100,000 on the program, but which about 15 to 20 of that was for athletic scholarships. However, that portion was already being covered through our foundation, so anybody can donate. Here at Truman, you can donate to any sport you want. It goes into an account for that sport. So the 15 to 20,000 that we've been spending on wrestling scholarships had been covered by the foundation, but salary and benefits for the coach, as well as all the other operating costs from travel, equipment. They had an operating budget basically of $20,000. So when you add the salary and benefits plus the operating budget, that's about $85,000 to $90,000 there. That would be eliminated, from our budget.
Yeah,
and then tennis.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say $120K it's not exactly a drop in the bucket when you're looking at a $3 million figure, but
right.
Looking at it. So what was the timeline? I mean, when did all these talks start, and when they say that wrestling and tennis were targeted? I mean, Mike, I guess one of my questions is were the coaches notified before the May 2nd announcement that they would have an opportunity to maybe raise some funds additionally to what they typically raise?
Right. They were not. Obviously, when you're considering decisions like this, to make it, to make that conversation started, obviously they're going to be against it. So I think typically when you've seen institutions drop programs, that obviously the coach and the program is basically informed pretty much on the day that it's going to be announced. When decisions like these are made, there's timing's not good. It's never good. Nobody ever wants to do this. I think anybody that sits in an athletic director chair never wants to do things like this. So they weren't. Obviously the budget process starts in the spring. Probably we initially, get a memo from on campus late February, early March, and looking at what the budget is, and then obviously, studying it over time and how to do that, and having meetings back and forth, and ultimately coming to this decision. So it was a couple month process.
Do you feel like sometimes it may be a little disingenuous to say, okay, we're going to cut your program, we didn't give you any warning? I mean, why would you not have given these two teams an opportunity to raise those funds? Because as we saw at Northern State a couple years ago, when they announced they were dropping, they raised about $330,000 in 9 days. So it's not something that's been unable to happen, especially at the Division II level. So knowing
right.
hindsight, do you kind of wish you would have said, hey, we're going to give you a chance to raise some money here?
That can be debated back and forth. I definitely see your point in that. Obviously that was their argument. Well, we can raise the money, and I guess, people have been able to donate to wrestling at Truman State for, 25 years. And I guess my reply is, where have they been? But if somebody, I think, and our president's met with the team, and we're continuing to talk about possible, alternative solutions. So that is in the works right now. And until something is finalized, I can't really share that. But I think those type of discussions, if there truly is some deep pockets out there, that maybe there could be a solution to this. But until something is agreed upon, really, there's really nothing to discuss on that front.
There's been some stuff filed my way in terms of meetings and such with the team, the program, maybe even the president. So have there been any meetings since, and has there been a figure given up that, okay, you're going to get, I'm hearing a rumor that there's going to be like a 1 year reprieve to raise money, or there's some deadlines to hit certain financial things to potentially keep one or both of these programs alive?
I think if something does come to fruition in that regard, it will be, public knowledge in the near future. So if that does come to fruition, I'd be glad to share that with you at that appropriate time. But at this time, nothing has been agreed to. So, really waiting to see what can be agreed to before we would have that discussion. But if something does come out of that and does come to fruition, I'd be glad to have that, further discussion with you about that.
One thing you just said, you're wondering where the alumni were. And I guess maybe my train of thought here is having to go through many of these cuts and hearing various different reasons behind them for the past 20 years is maybe perhaps letting the alumni base know. I mean, was there any effort to reach out to the alumni or the alumni association, be like, look, we know we're getting $20,000 a year for wrestling from the donations. Right. Now we say, hey, we really need a fundraising push here. I mean, I'm looking at this, perhaps why not be proactive instead of reactive and say, well, where was the money? Whereas maybe taking the effort to get the alumni involved, because everybody I've talked to that is a Truman State wrestling alum or a Truman State alum at all, overall, they speak about the experience they had at the school, how it's a very underrated place to go to college, and U.S. News and World Report's rankings are through the roof in terms of its academic cost effectiveness. And, I've never heard a bad thing about anybody who went to Truman State, whether they're an athlete or otherwise, until I guess this. And I'm guessing playing on that, people love Truman State, but why not entice them to say, hey, we're in a budget crunch. We need to save some programs here. I can't wrap my head around why wasn't like the alumni reached out to first instead of maybe afterwards.
We've had 2 capital campaigns in the last, 5 to 8 years. We've basically, I know from our president to our advancement, to our coaches even, our advancement has worked with our coaches. We've sent out multiple things to our alums saying, hey, donate to our programs. Funding from the university continues to not go up. So I feel like we have again, obviously we haven't gone out there and say, if you don't donate, we're going to cut the program. But I do feel like we've been very proactive. Our advancement office has done a great job. They'll work with any coach, and Coach Shooter has done a great job trying to reach out to alums and saying, hey, again, and the neat thing about Truman is, Jason, you could walk in tomorrow and say, I have a check here to Truman State. I want it to go specifically to wrestling. That check would go into the wrestling's account. That can only be spent on wrestling. So we've always, where a lot of, I know I've worked in different institutions like donate to athletics, and you're not sure where the money ends up. It goes into, one big athletic club, and, those opportunities aren't available to them. So, again, short of saying, hey, please donate because we're going to cut the program, I feel like, if you look back historically through our capital campaigns, through just general annual, we've done annual appeals every year to our alumni to say, hey, support your program. Those things have been out there and have been done.
In terms of the process, how much, you said you didn't have communication with the coaches prior to the announcement, because again, that's something that from your vantage point didn't seem like it would make a whole lot of sense until. But what's the role as a Division II athletic director, whereas you don't get you said you're not getting the NCAA money, and looking at the performance of some of the programs, not the department itself hasn't really had too many winning records. Basketball kind of being the outlier and making a couple tournament appearances, but what should the role of Division II athletics be at an institution like Truman State?
That's a good question, because I think Division II is unique. We're not Division one in the terms that, and I've worked at a couple different Division I schools, mid majors, and so obviously, if you look at the NCAA website, Division II, it's all about. Their slogan is "Make it yours," and really that. You're a student first and foremost, and, getting an education, not only getting an education, but getting a degree that, but also to be able to, participate in intercollegiate athletics at a level that, doesn't require you, maybe to be, for example, in Division II, we have a 7-day dead period over Christmas. So our kids get to go home for Christmas, where maybe at a Division I school, whether it's basketball, wrestling, whatever, they're practicing, on Christmas Eve or the day out. You got to be back the day after or whatever. So, obviously we want to win. Our goal is to win and be successful. And if you look at Truman State, I would put our women's programs overall up against anybody. We've had 6 national championships in women's swimming. We've had our volleyball team go to 2 national championship matches, consistently in the NCAA tournament team, those type of things that you just referenced, men's basketball, which did have not a lot of history of success. We just had 5 straight 20-win seasons, 2 straight NCAA tournament appearances. So those are all things we're very proud of. But like we tell our kids, if we accomplish all those things and you don't leave here with a degree, you really isn't going to mean a lot. And I think the thing I love about Truman State is that we practice what we preach. If you look at our graduation rates, for a public school, we're at the top. Like you said, the rankings are out the roof. Well, the rankings are out the roof in terms of graduation rates too. As far as we're one of the top public schools in the country in terms of graduation rates and those type of things.
So I guess that'll lead into my next question about the academic profile of the school. The announcement coming this late. I mean, we saw Eastern Michigan drop it just days after the NCAA championships. Nothing is quite as egregious as up at Omaha announcing they're cutting the program the night they win a Division II national title. That might be the most despicable thing I've ever seen in how to drop a sport. But in terms of the timing, I mean, we've got kids that are, the semester is ending, finals are coming up, they're signing leases for next year. It's really late in the process to look at, looking to transfer to find other places to wrestle or compete. Again, why May 2nd? I mean, could there have been a better way to make sure these athletes could have had an opportunity if they chose to stay, or if they're a lot of them are choosing to wrestle there because they offer wrestling and it's an affordable situation. So I think the timeline from an academic standpoint kind of also raises an eyebrow.
Right. Good question. Obviously, like I said before, when you make a decision like this, the timing there's never good timing. We could have waited another week or two after finals and when they left campus and said, hey, made the announcement, and obviously we would have been criticized for waiting till everybody left. I felt like, meeting with them face-to-face before the announcement was the right thing to do. Really, the final decision hadn't been made up until that time. So it wasn't like we made the decision right at the end of the season and said, oh, we're just going to sit on it and wait till May 2nd. So, the timing's never good. I understand all those arguments. Leases. I know my daughter goes to school here, and she always had to re-sign her lease in the fall. So, whether it would have been in March or May, I think they would have the same argument for leases and things like that would have been there. So, it's tough. It's tough and it's the toughest on the kids that are returning. We have 9 guys that were returning squad members, on our team, and it's obviously the toughest for those 9 guys, and I get that. I understand that, and but the timing, there could have been. I think any time a decision like this is made, the decision's obviously very criticized by people who are against it, and those type of arguments, can be made on why then or why whatever. So. Very tough, very tough decision. Not something that we wanted to do, and until we knew we were going to make a final decision, once we knew it was a final decision, we released it as soon as we could. We could meet with the teams and then release it.
Circling back to the decision and the decision-making process, what other options were on the board, or was it simply looking at elimination of sports?
Well, again, we were looking at a six-figure target to reduce from our budget. So, again, you look at Truman State. Obviously, we're Division II, and I think some of the things we looked at was we looked at all the public schools in Missouri, and of all the NCAA, we're one of 13 public schools in Missouri. And we sponsor more sports than any public school in Missouri, even the Division I schools. We have this, except for Mizzou, which Mizzou has 20 sports, and we have 20 sports. And then we looked at everybody's budget compared to ours. And even though we were sponsoring more sports than everybody, our budget, our expenditures were the lowest. So we're sponsoring the most programs, and we're spending the least, again, especially looking at our Division II counterparts in Missouri. And there's many, Missouri is a big Division II state. There's 14 Division II schools just in the state of Missouri. So when we looked at all the public schools and realized, we're sponsoring more than every other school in Missouri other than Mizzou, who's obviously in a different, Power 5 school, as you know, lives in a different world athletically than we do in terms of finances. And then we looked at across the country in Division II. The average number of teams per institution in Division II is 15.6. And the men's average is 7.2, and the women's is 8.4. So again, we had 10 men's programs. Again, we were the only public school in Missouri that was offering double-digit men's teams. So those are some of the things that we looked at to be like, this just isn't adding up. Can we maintain? Obviously, we want to provide experience that we feel that is a positive one for every student athlete out there. And we felt like after going through so many, again, I've been here 19 years. I love Truman State, and going through budget cuts over the years. In 2011, we actually discontinued men's golf, and in 4 sports said we weren't going to fund athletic scholarships from the school anymore, which wrestling was included in there. And that's why the money that they had been spending in scholarships was coming from the foundation. And then last year we took another cut across the board. And, again, just we felt like it was a time that we just couldn't do that anymore, looking at an insurmountable budget cut again to do that. And unfortunately, landed on this decision.
We look at the schools that are adding men's and in a lot of places women's wrestling as well. Smaller schools, some state schools, some private liberal arts colleges. I mean, it's kind of across the gamut, and the type of school that's adding it. And a lot of them have based it on, it's enrollment driven. It's tuition dollars that are coming in. Those students are paying tuition. And I just want to address one of the, I guess, alleged comments made that the wrestling team at Truman State was getting too much academic money, that they weren't bringing enough tuition money in. Is there any truth to that statement?
No, Jason. I mean, think about that. One, I don't even know how much academic aid each student at Truman gets, because that's really outside of athletics. I think that came about from, the argument was made as well, our tuition dollars, and I know you talked about this, on the Eastern Michigan broadcast, our tuition dollars pay for the cost of the wrestling program. Well, again, at Truman, one, tuition dollars don't pay for athletics. They pay for our educational experience here on campus. Again, my daughter goes to school here. She's not a student athlete. So does that mean I can say her tuition dollars, I want them to go toward her organization that she's in or anything like that? So that's not how it works. It pays for their classes, their professors, things like that. And so looking at that, and then how much are they really paying to go here? Again, Truman is a very cost-affordable, high-ranking school. So again, if you have the academic credentials and you get, we give out over $20 million in academic scholarships. So some of these kids, they're smart kids and they deserve, what they get in terms of scholarships. But some of them, wrestling across all of our sports, even before any athletic aid, some of them aren't paying any tuition at all. They're coming here for free. So my response to that was, I don't know how much every kid pays in tuition, but very few pay full tuition to go here. So and then all of a sudden I saw the headline, Truman wrestlers too smart, forced to drop program is just, that was mind-boggling. To me, that was just, some of the frustration of misinformation, I think, that was getting out there that, doesn't cost the university anything to have this program, which obviously is not true.
Now, hypothetically, if that roster goes from, anywhere from 13 to 17, wherever, depending on how much attrition there is, because the attrition does happen in college sports, especially at the subdivision 1 level. But say there's 15 more bodies that come into the wrestling program and 7 more bodies that want to walk on for the tennis program. It seems like, in theory, if the tuition dollars there would go into cutting out that budget, right? I mean, I'm just trying to understand the finances about it, because again, it's not an athletic cut. It's not $3.8 million in athletics. This is school wide, correct?
So can you ask that again, or can you rephrase
what I mean
that
is
again? Please?
We pointed out that, say your daughter, for example, her tuition dollars don't go to fund athletics. obviously not being a student athlete. What these student athletes are coming in, they're going there, they're paying tuition. The ones that do, would more bodies, like say if the roster doubled in size and there were 15 bodies that were paying tuition, it seems like that would be taking the athletic budget out of it. That's money coming into the school that could alleviate some of that budget shortfall. Am I off base in assuming that?
I think I've heard a lot of people, make that argument. I guess, it would depend on how the institution, would figure that. Again, if I add people to our roster here, our athletic budget doesn't go up. So when we get a budget for the year, and I have 400 student athletes or 470, I don't get more money in my budget as we add people. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get that. Now, one thing I am wondering about the budget side of things, these are two sports that are probably the most cost-effective across the board nationally. I mean, wrestling, you've got a mat space, and then you've got your travel. But with men's and women's tennis, this is the one that kind of boggles me the most. And this isn't necessarily directed just at Truman State, but when I see a cut of men's tennis and they keep the women's team, you usually compare the schedules. And most of the schedules are at the same spots in the same place. You guys have a situation where you have one person coaching both the men's and women's team. It doesn't seem like cutting the men's team is going to affect that budget a whole lot. And it seems like two of the cheaper programs to run universally around college sports are being cut here. And it's like, it doesn't seem like that has much of an impact on the budget as a whole. Again, even though six figures is nothing to sneeze at, it's like, okay, we're just cutting a little bit of fat here. You could probably have looked at other places to cut significantly more money than these two programs.
Again, going back to, I felt like we've done that over the years across the board, and we were at a point where we really couldn't squeeze any more out without doing something like this. For us in tennis, we did have an assistant position that is being eliminated by not having men. So we had two coaches in tennis. Now we're only going to have one, as well as the travel. Again, the operating budget for tennis, men and women each had a separate budget, so that operating budget is going away. And a lot of people have said that. Well, why that? It's one of your cheapest sports or whatever. But again, if you look across Canton, and everybody comes up with if 50 people come up with a $10,000 savings idea, that's $500,000. So there's no idea too small or too large that could go into looking at what would need to be done in terms of cutting costs. So I can understand where people would say that, why that, but again, whether it's 10,000, 25,000, or 100,000, a lot of people, if we didn't do a 15,000 cut there and 10 other people didn't do the same, $15,000 cut, there's still a $200,000 problem. So it adds up pretty quick.
One thing I also want to point out is we talked about the coaching staff, and Coach Shooter's been there 28 years, in his mid-50s, and is one of the few disabled American veterans in college coaching. And the optics of this don't look very good. Let's be honest, that the only full-time person getting the axe is somebody who served in the armed forces and has been a coach there for longer than anybody else. It doesn't look like it's a nice way of saying, hey, thanks for your service, see ya.
Well, again, this decision wasn't based on who's in what position. It's based on what Truman State University, what sports that we sponsor. For him, obviously, the decision is not a good one for him because it affects the sport. We're dropping the sport that he happened to coach. So it really has nothing to do with him. I've been here for 19. I've worked with Dave for 19 years. So again, like I just came in here yesterday and said, okay, I want to do away with wrestling. So again, it's a tough decision. Tough decisions are being made all across our campus. They're obviously just not as public as this one, but not the only one that where things are being cut across our campus to do what's best for Truman State University. So ultimately, that's what obviously in my role or whatever role that to do what we need to do what's best for the university.
Is it safe to say you think that he probably could have been done better here in this situation? You know, you said it's a tough decision, but again, you're looking at a guy that's given more than half his life to a school, and again, he's the only full-time casualty here. I mean, in a perfect world, how do you make something like this, I guess, easier for the one person most impacted by this?
Well, again, these decisions are never easy. So, you know, it was a tough decision to do that. And, you know, I don't know what else. I don't know what. I really don't have anything else to say on that.
All right. Last thing I want to discuss, and again, I do appreciate your time and openness to be able to discuss this topic. Again, not something I like to talk about a whole lot. I'd rather talk about getting ADs and coaches on adding the sport of wrestling, which we've seen here recently. But the Great Lakes Valley Conference, in which Truman State's an all-sports member in, started to sanction wrestling a couple years ago with the addition of Bellarmine, and you know, we've had Drury and Maryville, two schools in Missouri that have added the sport of wrestling. Granted, it's different dynamics because they are private schools, but was there any thought about what this could do to the other schools within the conference? Because it is a conference sport. You're dropping two conference sports, and that affects their scheduling. That affects the entire conference scheduling. That affects their budgets in terms of, okay, we're going to go to Truman. We're going to wrestle try here. Well, now the whole conference, and being a conference sport, is impacted by this decision.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, we. You know, I talked to our commissioner about it when the decision was made, and you know, I think that's a good point. You look at the conference. You know, with Parkside leaving our conference, all the wrestling programs are private schools. So going back to, you mentioned a lot of schools are adding it. I think the majority of those schools have been private institutions. So you know, with us not having wrestling, really, there's no public school in the GLVC that is sponsoring the sport of wrestling. And you know, I think looking across Division II with over 300 institutions in Division II, you know, and approximately 60 sponsoring wrestling. So you know, around 20% of entire Division II sponsoring the sport of wrestling. But yeah, obviously, you know, it leaves them and having to change what the conference schedule may look like for next year. So, you know, and I'm sure they'll deal with it at the conference. But I think that, yeah, when you look at it, every school sponsoring wrestling, you know, in the GLVC now is all private schools.
It's a fair point to mention too, but also when we look at the addition of wrestling programs since 2000, which is kind of the point where the massive cuts that we'd seen due to safe harbor, and you know, we're not going to beat the Title IX drum too much here, even though every athletic cut, that number has to come into mind. You know, if you that's why there's two men's teams being cut, because if you cut women, you could find yourself into a Title IX issue. But 29 schools in Division II have added wrestling in the last 18 years, so that's half of it are new programs. So the prevailing.
How many of those were public schools?
Well, let's do a quick math. Let's see. That's a good point. Let's see. We've got New Mexico Highlands is public. I'm pretty sure Colorado Mesa is public. See, Colorado State Pueblo. There's three right there. I mean, it's less than half, but it is there's a number of public schools in there. I mean, we're adding new programs with Urbana, Kentucky Wesleyan next year. Yes, they are private. Bellarmine started up when St. Catherine's closed, so there is a point to be made about the private schools, but the alignment. But again, the conference does include public schools in other sports as well. So I'm not sure if the public-private thing is as much as a prevailing reason than anything else, other than you've got two schools in Missouri that were travel partners for the rest of the conference.
Yeah, I guess that just kind of came up in the discussion, and I think that.
I was not trying to throw anything here. I was just looking at it because I keep a track of all these added programs. So it's But
I think again for us, for Truman overall, when you look at the big picture, again, even if we reduce, we had 20, we were sponsoring 20 sports. So with the reduction of 2, we're at 18. We're still sponsoring more sports than every public school in Missouri, NCAA institution. You can go all on down the line from, Central Missouri Northwest, Missouri Western, Missouri Southern, UMKC, Missouri State, SEMO, UMSL, Lincoln. We sponsor more sports. So for us, for people to say, well, Truman, obviously in the wrestling world, yeah, it stinks because we're not going to have wrestling. But when you look at the big picture of sports sponsorship and providing opportunities for student athletes, we're providing more teams than anybody in the state for men, and we're still providing just as many, if not more, than most of them, even if we have two less. So when you look at the big picture of it all, what we were trying to do, nobody else, Jason, if you look at nobody else in our state as a public institution was trying to do what we were trying to do. And they're all spending more money on athletics than we are. So you see where I'm coming from on that?
Yeah, I get it. And pointing out, though, that leaves just one Division II opportunity within the state. You'd mentioned earlier that's a Division II kind of state. There's a lot of Division II teams. I think you said there were 14 Division II programs within the state, leaving just Central Missouri as the only option for the Division II public school kid. So, go ahead.
You look at our roster. We didn't have any freshmen we had one incoming freshman last year on our entire roster, and he was from Florida. So I don't know why I know the argument's been made that Missouri is growing in Missouri, but we didn't have any Missouri kids come to Truman last year.
And not to take a bar, but doesn't see there obviously no more are going to be coming anyway. But as we wrap up here again, appreciate the time on this. Never a good situation for anybody to be in. But as we move forward, we talked about were there any solutions that could be moving forward? How soon could something be released? What can you say about discussions to save one or both of these sports? That we could potentially revisit this matter in the future?
I would say if something were to happen, it would be within the next week. So, sometime next week at the latest. If it doesn't happen by, the end of next week or before we go into Memorial Day, I would say it won't. But, and I'd be glad to if something does happen, I'd be glad to reach out to you and let you know something is in play. Talk to you about that.
All right,
but it would be within the next week or so.
Well, I look forward to hearing from you, hopefully in the future, and that'll probably wrap us up for this edition of the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. I'd like to thank Kevin White, the Senior Associate AD and the Director of Communications at Truman State, for helping facilitate this request. And there's not every AD is going to put themselves out there and answer these questions. And matter of fact, some of them like to cower behind. No comment. I appreciate you taking the time out and answering these questions. I appreciate your associate AD in communications, for lack of a better term, the SID, for really making sure this thing happens. So I want to give Kevin his props on that and doing what a good athletic director's communications savant should be doing. So without him, this interview doesn't happen. And again, I want to thank you for your time and answering these questions about the potential future or potential legacy of Truman State Wrestling.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Again, I'd like to thank Kevin White and Jerry Wollmering for facilitating that interview here on the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. Never a good time to drop a program in any sport. Of course, we're fighting alongside the men's tennis program there, as well as they were also cut and mentioned that several times on the program. And this is the first time listening to the program. This is the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. I am Jason Bryant, and it's news, reviews, previews, and interviews. If you want to check this program out, go to matttalkonline.com/listen. It'll get you all the different ways to subscribe on your favorite podcatcher of choice. If you want to listen on the web, you want to listen on Spotify, you want to listen on Spreaker, Stitcher, the podcast app on your iOS device, or if you want your own specific app, then you just want to listen to this show, matttalkonline.com/listen. There's a spot where you can download the app for both iOS and Android through the Google Play Store. Absolutely free. Listen at your convenience. Now, if you're also a fan of this program and the network, I would implore you to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, or do us one better by joining our team at matttalkonline.com/contribute. Those contributions, whether it be one time or monthly, keep the lights on, keep us promoting the sport of wrestling with, again, news, reviews, previews, and interviews from people that you may or may not have heard of. We've had Dan Dennis just showed up on the mat. Kyle Klingman and Andy Hamilton's program, produced by the National Wrestling Hall of Fame's Dan Gable Museum. We've also got some team shows from Old Dominion, NC State, and Virginia Tech, and a host of others here on the network at MadTalkOnline.com. So if you like what you hear, hit the tip jar up at MadTalkOnline.com/contribute. So as you may have heard in the interview, I did ask a couple times if there was any meetings or such, and while we didn't get a definitive answer and what he would or would not say on the record in terms of any type of financial reprieve that's being offered, I am hearing that there is some discussion about extending one more year and giving the program deadlines to hit certain dollar figure amounts. That dollar figure amount allegedly is to provide enough funds to essentially endow the $120,000, or I think it's somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000 a year that is being told that they need to survive year by year. And I'm not a math guy, but I understand that endowment figure is approaching $2 million. So I know that number in the bank will generate enough interest to keep certain aspects of the program alive. So we're working to see if that will actually be announced in the near future by the school, but that's just what I'm hearing from people close to the situation at Truman State. That's all I've got for this episode of the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. If you're down in Rochester, Minnesota on May 18th, 19th, and 20th, come say hi. I'll be on the mic at the USA Wrestling World Team Trials next week. We got a pretty good week for you. We got Danny Irwin. I've been teasing that one for a while from Wheeling Jesuit. Joan Fulp and Andrea Yamamoto talking women's wrestling. Cliff Fretwell's going to make an appearance in the coming days, and just some great stuff here in the summertime with Short Time. So I'd like to thank you for spending your time with me, because you've always got time for Short Time. Oh, yeah. The Short Time Wrestling Podcast is proudly outfitted by Compound Clothing. Shirts, singlets, custom gear orders, everything you need. Call up Cliff and the crew at cmpteamwear.com. First time listening? Well, you can change that by going to MadTalkOnline.com/GetShortTime to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or listen on your favorite podcatcher at MadTalkOnline.com/listen.
This show is part of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. For more wrestling podcasts, head over to MadTalkOnline.com.